The first screen entertainment in Western Australia took place on July 29th, 1853, when a travelling showman pitched a tent in Perth and gave a magic lantern show comprised of comic strips. On December 2nd, 1853, it is recorded in the West Australian that a magic lantern and slides had been procured for the Mechanics' Institute, and regular entertainments for the people would be given. Evidently, the first show so pleased those who saw it that arrangements were made for a continuance of these entertainments. The first to offer films was Ye Olde English Fayre at the corner of Hay and King Streets and the Cremorne Gardens at the other end of Murray Street. Jones and Lawrence actually introduced the new medium to Perth audiences for the first time in late 1896 at Ye Olde English Fayre. Although the Town Hall, 1870, St George's Hall, 1879, and in some cases the Swan River Mechanics' Institute, 1851, were used for the staging of live theatre, the need for a purpose-built theatre in Perth had been long felt in the community. With the gold rush, Perth became the capital of a thriving and progressive colony, which was considered to be without a single decent place of amusement of any sort, and, but for the ill-fated and dreary Town Hall and St George's Hall. According to the newspapers, Perth had been absolutely bare of any convenience for theatrical and musical performances until the kind-hearted hostess of the Horse and Groom Tavern at 42 Godrich Street, now Murray Street, upgraded her humble inn into a well-appointed two-storey hotel named the Westralian. Next, ornamental gardens were laid out, then an indoor theatre built. Jones and Lawrence were then managing the talent, and lots of coin was to be made. The coin simply flowed in. It was better than a Wealth of Nations or an Eldorado. My, how the boys spent, and how the girls loved the boys. Everything was lovely. Them was the days, as an old chap said, once Mrs. Annie Oliver secured. The whole place lock, stock, barrel, things boomed. Mrs. Oliver was a well-liked, respectable and astute businesswoman who was probably one of the busiest and most enterprising women in Western Australia. A cinematograph machine was obtained to project films in the Cremorne Theatre. The first exhibition of pictures took place at 8:30 o'clock and again at 9:30 o'clock. Another performance was given with an admission fee of $1 being charged. The cinematograph projected film at a speed of 16 frames per second, much slower than Edison's kinetoscope device, which was 48 frames per second, which meant that it was less noisy to operate and used less film. Lumiere's 1895 film, Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory, is considered to be the very first motion picture. After making more than 40 films in 1896, mostly scenes of everyday French life, they began sending other cameramen, projectionists, out into the world to record scenes of life and showcase their invention. When Mrs. Oliver took over the old Horse and Groom Hotel and grounds, the latter were but a series of backyards, not particularly clean and inviting, and the amount of trouble and expense involved in bringing about the transformation of a positive eyesore into a perfect beauty spot on the face of our capital city. The Cremorne Gardens opened on Christmas Eve 1895. Then in June 1896, the indoor Cremorne Theatre was opened. The admission was $1 to all parts of the gardens, where cosy cane chairs and lounges and marble-top tables were distributed over the lawns singly and in groups around the concert rotunda, which stood in the centre. This rotunda was later moved to the Perth Esplanade, where it served for years as a bandstand shelter. The gardens, which adjoined the bungalow veranda of the saloon bar, were maintained beautifully. The Royal was built at 637 to 645 Hay Street, Perth, by businessman Thomas George Anstrutter Malloy, a landowner, builder, speculator and local government politician. Additional investment was provided by his partner and the presiding Perth Mayor, Alexander Forrest. It was completed by Gustav Lieb and opened on 19th of April 1897. Molloy as a mayor in 1908 and 9 and again in 1911-12. In 1904, Alexander Forrest also assisted Molloy financially in the building of the adjoining Metropole Hotel. By 1904, Molloy had also built his Majesty's Theatre, which replaced Ye Olde English Fayre. His Majesty's for many years had the largest stage in Australia. The Royal opened on the 19th of April 1897 under the management of Jones and Lawrence. It was initially used for variety, drama and Perth's early film screenings before eventually being converted into a permanent cinema. First as a whole, then just the upper level. Initially seating upwards of 2,000 patrons, the building was also designed with the largest sliding roof in Australia, a necessity for cooling the auditorium down during the summer months. Molloy had the good sense to equip his two sturdy theatres with sliding roofs which could open to the night sky in summertime. The opening arranged by the lessees of the theatre, Messrs Jones and Lawrence, was marked by a performance of The Silver King by the Stanford and Barnes Company. Unfortunately, Jones and Lawrence filed for bankruptcy only a year after the theatre opened. After Jones and Lawrence pulled out, the theatre was then leased by Charles Holloway and William Anderson. In May, they brought Williamson and Musgrove's Royal Comic Opera to the West for the first time. They also brought to Perth the first production of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. In 1902, management changed again, this time to Harry Rickards, a famous vaudeville star who came from the eastern states and introduced more vaudeville and variety acts. Because of this style of entertainment, the theatre was no longer a venue just for the middle to upper class community. And so Rickards introduced a tiered system of ticket prices according to seating, so that shows were affordable for everyone. In 1907, William Anderson became the manager, and although he retained the vaudeville and variety acts introduced by Rickards, he also reintroduced more traditional plays. In May 1910, a firm by the name of Royal Pictures attempted a season of film-only entertainment at the Royal. The lack of a regular supply of new films for the ventures made things difficult, though, and by September these nights were scaled back to 2 a week. The theatre was soon afterwards closed for renovations. The work carried out at this time included a fireproof firebox for the film projector, allowing it to be separated from the audience. In 1912, the Theatre Royal was remodelled for £9,000 sterling to fulfil lease conditions made with Cosner Spencer, a Sydney movie mogul. The Royal reopened under the management of Spencer, who also screened films at the more modest Esplanade Gardens, leasing both premises for this purpose. In February 1918, Thomas, later Sir Thomas Coombe, took over the lease. In this respect, it became one of the several theatres he bought, which subsequently became part of the Union Theatres chain. From 1926 to around 1931, the Royal was leased by Sir Benjamin and John Fuller, Fuller's Theatres Limited, whose Australian and New Zealand vaudeville circuit was still the largest operating at that time. Under the management of Union Theatres, the venue offered both film and variety in the same entertainment package, a practice which many firms had adopted right from the early years of Australian cinema. When the Fullers divested themselves of the theatre, the lease was taken over by Hamilton Brown. During his period of management, the Royal was wired for sound. Queen's Hall, 1899 to 1926. On the 19th of April, 1899, the Premier, Sir John Forrest, opened the Romanesque-style Queen's Hall in William Street. Entrance was obtained from William Street, through a marble-tiled vestibule, 15 foot wide, then ascent up a dozen marble steps that led to a corridor which ran to an auditorium. It was by far the largest and, to all appearances, the most commodious hall of its kind in Perth. The first film exhibition was only months after the official opening. On August the 16th, 1899, Commandant Booth opened a special campaign to inform the citizens of Perth of the operations of the Salvation Army through his wonderful and thrilling lecture, assisted by limelight, kinematograph and graphophone. Mrs. Booth conducted a further series of limelight lectures in the hall in September 1900 and in October 1901. This was where Perth witnessed the remarkable Melbourne production of Soldiers of the Cross, 2 hours of films, slides, exhortations, prayers and music. The Corrick family entertainers were showing repackaged and complete versions of the latest special effects, comedy and actuality, that is non-fiction, films in black and white and dazzling colour, screened with live musical accompaniment provided by the family. Leonard's beautiful pictures formed part of a variety act which toured Australasia, Southeast Asia and Europe from 1897 to 1914.
An amazing archive of over 130 films made at the start of the 20th century and stored in a garage has been restored and saved by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. Enter a world of fantasy, romance, exotic lands and vivid reality. The marvellous Corricks, a talented family of musical entertainers from New Zealand, first toured these silent films in the early 1900s. The films were uncovered in a garage in the Australian state of Tasmania many years later. Some of the oldest films in the world, thought lost, have now been found and restored. It's a window into life, over 100 years ago.
Then on 20th of June 1908, West Pictures were transferred from His Majesty's, where they had been running continuously 6 nights a week for 5 weeks. This was the first truly permanent film show in the state, intended to continue indefinitely, though still not in purpose-built premises. West's success was unprecedented in the state. The company had access through its contacts, interstate and overseas, to an inexhaustible supply of films, enabling a weekly change of program and a confident claim that all pictures presented were exclusive and had not been screened in Perth before. At the end of 1911, the lease was transferred from West to Vix Pictures, a company owned by 4 partners, one of whom was T.J. West's former secretary, Victor Newton. Another of the partners, Jack Coulter, later to be manager of the Capitol, was the projectionist. It was probably the rash of purpose-built cinemas in the rest of the decade that forced the closure of Queen's Hall as a venue for moving pictures in January 1919. The hall reverted to casual hire, including being used as a department store for a year after the former premises of economic stores were burnt down in January 1920. Charles Sudoltz opened King's Picture Gardens in December 1908 and screened at the Town Hall in the winter. The Melrose Gardens, 1908 to 1911. In 1908, the British exhibitor Thomas James West, 1855-1916, added the Melrose and Queen's Hall to a chain he had quickly established throughout Australia. Fremantle, Midland and country towns soon followed suit in proclaiming West's pictures. Similarly, C.C. Spencer came to dominate the screens at King's Esplanade Gardens and the Theatre Royal. West's pictures were amongst the first to screen films with the electric arc lamp as an illuminant. They had the agency for urban projectors, and films were screened together with a musical program. Shaftesbury, 1911-1924. On the fringes of the city proper in James Street, the Shaftesbury Gardens was built on the site of a woodyard. It officially opened on Saturday the 11th of March 1911, exactly 1 month after the more central Melrose Gardens. The new Gardens was even larger than its competitor, 3,000 seats to the Melrose's 2,000, and began with particularly low prices, 1 shilling for front stalls, 6pence for back stalls, and 3pence for the gallery. The Shaftesbury was owned by Thomas Alfred Shafto, who came to Western Australia in 1896. He opened the Victoria Coffee Palace in Wellington Street, Perth, then later built the Shaftesbury Hotel, situated on Stirling Street, Perth. Film screenings ceased in May 1918 to then become a vaudeville venue until it closed in 1924. Film screenings started again in 1925 and the theatre was renamed the Luxor Theatre and then renamed the Luxor Picture Theatre in 1936. It was renamed again to the Tivoli Theatre in the 1940s. Star Picture Pavilion. The Star skating rink became the Star Picture Pavilion for summer film screenings. It was renamed the Tivoli skating rink and went right through to St George's Terrace. It once again began functioning as a theatre with a season of Rickard's Vaudeville and West Pictures from 1913. It finally closed in 1915 to become first a dance hall, then a motor garage. Spencer's Esplanade Gardens, 1911. Charles Cozzens Spencer was a British-born film exhibitor and producer who was a significant figure in the early years of the Australian film industry. He produced films under the name of Spencer's Pictures and was an early backer of the films of Raymond Longford. He made a fortune exhibiting the Great Train Robbery in Australia and soon became the leading exhibitor in the country. He moved into production, establishing a permanent production unit in 1908. Spencer came to dominate the screens at King's Esplanade Gardens and the Theatre Royal in Perth. Empire Picture Palace, 1911 to 1914. In 1911, located at 227 Murray Street, Perth, the Empire Picture Palace was the first purpose-built hardtop cinema in Western Australia. It only opened briefly, it then changed owners and in 1912 was renamed the King's Picture Palace, but then ceased operations again in early 13 to change ownership again and be renamed the Melbourne Picture Hall until it closed permanently in 1914. The Melrose Picture Theatre, 1911 to 1922, the open-air Melrose Garden was turned into a barn-like establishment in 1911, which 11 years later was transformed into the prestigious Prince of Wales Theatre that opened in December 1922. This was sited next to the Baird's department store. Pavilion, 1914 to 1930. The pretty little Pavilion Theatre, proclaimed to be Perth's continuous pictures, was at 709 to 711 Hay Street. It had only 870 seats, and the admission prices were small, threepence and sixpence. There was at least an hour and a half's entertainment that appealed to both old and young, a gazette, several two-reelers, and a comic. Most of the Keystone comedies with Charlie Chaplin and Mabel Normand were beloved by the children and filled the theatre with yells of laughter. Then there was Max Linder, the mercurial Frenchman who once introduced a lot of fleas into a French court to confound and confuse the course of justice so that he might escape. The Pavilion Theatre opened on the 9th of February 1914 and closed in 1930, for it lacked the audience comforts of the more modern cinemas that followed. It was turned into Perth's first 18-hole miniature golf course, then was bought by Walsh's Menswear in 1932, who operated from the building until they moved to the former Cox Brothers Economic Store on the corner of Hay and William. The building remains today, but it's unrecognisable as its former self. Britannia, 1915-1918. The Britannia opened on the 1st of April 1915. It was built by a local businessman and managed by a local showman, Hamilton Brown, in its formative years. Like the Pavilion, which initiated this policy, it was small, cheap and screened continuously from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. The auditorium was an exceedingly lofty one, provided with a large sliding roof and a maximum amount of fan and other ventilation, thus ensuring a lower temperature during the warmer weather. There was comfortable seating for 880 persons, of whom the dress circle took about 260. A double staircase led to the dress circle and to the lounge and offices in front of the building. The Britannia had a good reputation for quality programming. The cinema closed on 18th of May 1918, only 3 years after its optimistic opening. Grand, 1916 to 1980. The Grand Theatre opened on Wednesday the 20th September 1916, with a seating capacity of 1,300, with 1,000 in the stalls and 300 in the dress circle. It was built for entrepreneur Thomas Coombe for a cost of £20,000 sterling. It had a windlass-operated sliding roof and also removable shutters on the side walls to allow for cross-ventilation. In September 1929, the theatre abandoned its orchestra and was wired for sound, with the screenings of its first talkie, The Midnight Taxi, occurring on the 2nd of September 1929. While initially independent, it became part of the Union Theatres chain, but during the Great Depression it was under financial threat. In 1931 it was sold for £82,000 sterling to Town and Suburban Properties Limited, who leased it back to Union Theatres. On the 29th of April 1932 it became an all-British house, showcasing the most prestigious British films. In August 1932 the company was unable to maintain their rental payments, and the bailiffs were brought in, with the theatre being taken over by the property owners. On the 25th of August 1932, Town and Suburban Properties Limited formed a new company, the Grand Theatre Company. The Majestic, 1916 to 1937. The Majestic at 656 Hay Street had a policy of cheap admissions and continuous screenings, and to meet with public demand, movie sound equipment was installed in 1930. The Majestic was demolished in 1937, taking over the neighbouring building between the theatre and the Savoy Hotel to use the expanded block to erect a modern arcade with shops on the street level and the Plaza Cinema seating 1,313 above. The theatre was renamed the Paris in 1965 and finally closed in 1984. Also, in 1916, another Majestic theatre opened in High Street, Fremantle. It seated 1,000 and was located in a building that still stands in the port city today. In August 1918, the lease was taken over by J.C. Williamson Films, a movie-making unit of the theatrical firm J.C. Williamson Limited, which produced a number of feature films during the 1914-18 war period. Palladium, 1918-1925. A well-known racing man, Bill Lean, built the silent film-only cinema, the Palladium, at 723 Hay Street. William Lean opened both his Palladium theatres in 1916, the first in Fremantle and the second on the 15th of December in Hay Street, Perth. The Perth Palladium was slightly larger than the Pavilion and the Britannia, which were its main competition. The Palladium could boast of a full orchestra at evening performances. It could also boast a sliding roof and elaborate cooling system. Though the theatre closed in 1925, the building still exists and is clearly identified as Bacton House. Prince of Wales Theatre, 1922-1935. When the building boom of the 20s was in full swing, Sir Thomas Combe realised the potential of his prime site in Murray Street, and so the Melrose was converted into a more modern structure, the Prince of Wales Theatre. Hamilton Brown was employed by Combe as manager for the new theatre. The prestigious Prince of Wales Theatre opened at 254 Murray Street, Perth in December 1922. To present vaudeville for the first half, followed by a short film comedy or cartoon before the interval and the feature film. The theatre was the largest in Perth at the time, with over 2,000 seats. There was a refrigerator in the foyer for the storage of perishables, while shoppers attended a screening, and an attendant in immaculate apron and cap would issue a ticket for parcels lodged, just like lodging your coat in a cloakroom. The Australian blockbuster, for the term of his natural life, had its Perth premiere there. In 1926, the silent movie industry in the United States was declining due to radio and the increasing popularity of recorded music, in the form of gramophone records which offered something that the movie theatres lacked at the time, that is, sound. People no longer had to leave their homes for entertainment and could enjoy music, comedy or drama simply by tuning in or playing a record. The Prince of Wales was one of two cinemas to introduce sound film to Perth on April 6, 1929. While the Regent screened The Red Dance using sound on film, the Prince presented Warner's The Jazz Singer using sound on disc. Regent Theatre, 1927 to 1938. In 1927, Hoyt secured the lease of the Queen's Hall site for their Perth Regent, one of a chain of major cinemas to be built in each state capital. Accommodation was provided for nearly 2,000 people with comfortable upholstered chairs fitted throughout. The principal colour scheme was formed of a neatly interwoven combination of mauve, cyclamen and gold, which gave a charm of beauty and brightness and an artistic magnificence unparalleled in theatres elsewhere in Perth. On the 4th of August 1928, a Wurlitzer theatre organ was installed which survived the various renovations and alterations of the theatre till it was removed before the site's demolition in 1973. In early 1928, Hoyt's circuit in Perth consisted of the Regent and the Majestic in Perth, the Majestic in Fremantle and the Majestic and Cremorne in Kalgoorlie. The first sound films in Perth opened simultaneously at the Regent and the Prince of Wales on the 6th of April 1929. The Regent screening The Red Dance using the sound on film process, and the Prince of Wales The Jazz Singer on the Vitaphone sound on disc process. The Red Dance had no spoken dialogue at all and just a musical score. The Ambassadors, 1928 to 1972.
A compact 800-seat cinema will take the place of one of the great picture palaces of Australia. Ambassadors will disappear, and Perth will lose not only a 45-year-old landmark, it will see the end of the 2,000-seater cinema era. Eric Nichols, who was associated with Ambassadors over the years from opening night in 1928, is himself retiring from the cinema industry this week after almost 52 years as a projectionist.
Of course, I'm sad to see this beautiful building torn down, not just because of its beauty, but because almost every stone, every step, every seat in the place had a story to tell, and every West Australian must have been in it at one time or another. And I remember opening night so vividly, Premier Phil Collier officiating. It was just like a Hollywood premiere. Crowds in evening dress, bright lights, and all the glamour the city could muster. By the way, evening dress was worn on Saturday nights for many years. The program was Glorious Betsy and Honeymoon Hate. In the theatre itself, it was a new world for the crowds, 2,000 of them. It was laid out as a replica of the Florentine garden, artificial pine trees, creepers, vines, doves, statues, even stars in the ceiling, and clouds that drifted above the audience. It was all breathtaking for cinema goers in the 20s and 30s. The machinery itself was a wonder, and we had to climb up and adjust it every so often for new effects. In fact, just above the upper foyer staircase, you would walk under famous Bridge of Sighs, and behind you, you'd see a glorious picture. And there was always a program of complete entertainment. For instance, there was always a type of variety show. There was Bert Howell and his orchestra. They provided the mood music for the films as well, for there were no talkies at the Ambassadors yet. There was a famous Ambassadors Corps de Ballet. They were marvellous, spectacular. Entertainers too. Alwyn Kurtz of Homicide was a spook at the Ambassadors. He used to parade up and down the footpath with his braided uniform and cane, spooking the current program. It was a marvellous era. But of course the depression of the early 30s took its toll. Even Ambassadors had to close down for some months. Thank goodness it wasn't for long. In fact, it sprang up again with new vigour, with Les Walden at the mighty Wurlitzer organ. I remember at that period, and during this period, a lot of furnishings were removed. The pines and the statues went. I left Ambassador about 1937 and went to New Plaza, which had just opened. It is the Paris now, but Ambassadors went on.
Now, the Ambassador's curtain is down forever, and an era has been erased from Perth's Hay Street, but not from the memory for years to come.
Capital, 1929 to 1968. The finely decorated Capitol Theatre opened in 1929, where the lounge foyer featured a bust of the great silent star Rudolph Valentino, and the legend has it that the bust's lips were constantly red with the adoring but heartbroken kisses of his Perth fans. The bust is today part of the WA Performing Arts Museum collection at His Majesty's Theatre. Though initially a cinema with the advent of television, the Capitol confined itself to orchestral concerts and other stage shows until its demolition in 1967. As a live theatre, its stage was graced by some of the 20th century's legendary performers, including Noel Coward, Vivian Leigh and Sir Laurence Olivier. At the base of William Street, next to the Capitol Theatre, was Elder House, which occupied Temple Court. This building also housed the Embassy Ballroom, a popular dance hall. The Art Deco Plaza opened in 1937 on the site of the Majesty, followed by the Art Deco Piccadilly in 1938. Also in 1938, the Metro replaced the Regent on the same spot. Jack Honorball talked about the little-known stories of the rise and decline of Perth's picture theatres for the Australian Museum of Motion Picture and Television in 2013. Jack also wrote a history of cinema for the publication The Moving Image, The History of Film and Television in Western Australia, 1895 to 1985. The switchover from silent to sound in the American film industry, which began in late 1927, was primarily complete by 1929, though even in that year silent pictures continued to be produced, though at a heavily reduced rate. In all, the silent film era lasted from 1895 to 1936, with Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times being made in 1936. Sadly, a September 2013 report by the United States Library of Congress announced that a total of 70% of American silent feature films are believed to be completely lost.